Hello and welcome back to the channel. Today I decided we will talk a little bit about the Nordic shipbuilding tradition, Viking ships and all that sort of fun things. And of course everybody has their own idea of what a Viking ship is. Has entered popular culture and it inevitably is either the OSEBERG or the Jokstad vessels. Both of them found ship burials in Norway, what is today Norway. But there is much more to it. I believe I have mentioned it in previous episodes of this, that archaeology is a science that does not like originality. We like repetition. We like multiple examples from the same period, from the same type of vessel, because this is the only way that we can draw greater conclusions. If you find one vessel, it is one vessel. Does not mean that every single vessel is built this way. So that leads us into the story of both the Jokstad and the OSEBERG ship. The OSEBERG ship, which among the many kits that exist of this vessel, one of the newest is the one by Pavel Nikitin, and his products have frequently been featured on the SYSTER channel and also, in truth, on my own too. Returning to the OSEBERG versus Jokstad ship. The OSEBERG ship is the earlier 9th century vessel. The Jokstad is 10th century, so it is a bit later, but they were discovered in reverse order. And somehow, in popular culture, it has entered that these are drakars. Every kit that I have ever seen of the OSEBERG ship claims that this is a drakar. That, of course, is not true. The OSEBERG vessel was simply a pleasure boat, a prestige vessel, the private property, personal fun boat of a local ruler, female in this case, but it was not a warship, it was not, definitely not a drakar. So where does this lead us? There are a couple of things that I would like to discuss with you now. The really great substantial discovery in Nordic seafaring, I would say, were the Shipwrecks. There are wrecks in this area in the fjord of Skudlev, which is the approach to the medieval Danish capital of Roskilde. Was of course no great news. It's been known since time immemorial. Fishermen were finding bits and pieces of timber. One of the timber supporting essentially a mast step was discovered in the 1920s and was preserved in the National Museum. It was reported back then in the press. So everybody knew that there are wrecks, that there are ships in that area, that they are probably medieval and most likely from the Viking-Age, because that mast step was showing very great similarities to the mast steps found both on the OSEBERG and on the Jokstad ship. So in the 1950s, a young group of archaeologists led by a wonderful young archaeologist by the name of Ole Kroum Pedersen, who most unfortunately passed away in 2011, quite young really. They began the excavations underwater, but pretty much after the first season, the depth was so shallow, less than 2 meters in this area, that they continued the excavation as a dryland. They built a coffer dam, pumped the water dry and carried out as a dryland excavation. This was perfectly feasible and sensible approach in Denmark, which is far to the north where it is wet and there was no danger of the timbers drying out. It is a lot less sensible approach when you are on the south coast of Texas and temperatures tend to be between 90 and 110. Then things take a different turn, shall we say. Returning to the wrecks. They were all intentionally sunk. They were partially dismantled at the time of the sinking. They were sunk with the purpose of blocking the approach to the medieval capital. But the interesting, so this is the background history of the vessels. That's how much was known at the time. So there are no interesting finds associated for the general public. There are no treasures, no weaponry, no living material culture, shall we say. They are only the wrecks, my kind of archaeology. Now that is what I love. The ships were excavated, they were documented very, very thoroughly. They have been under study since the beginning of the 60s, all the way really until the 90s, when the Roskilde Museum published a fantastic volume on the wrecks from Skudlev. There was supposed to be a second volume dealing with how the models and the modeling process of these vessels, but as of now, I do not know the status of that publication. As I said, Kroum Pedersen unfortunately passed away in 2011. I do not know if such a volume will ever come out. Be this as it may, the importance of these wrecks is they were reasonably well preserved, okay, but they showed us within the same shipbuilding tradition a very great variety of types of vessels. Up to this point, we have had this image. Oh, that's the only way that Vikings built ships, because hey, we have the OSEBERG ship, we have even the Jokstad ship, and they both look broadly similar, although the Jokstad is much more massive. If this was a coastal pleasure boat, the Jokstad ship was, after all, a small warship. As you probably are aware, a replica was built back in the 1890s, and a sturdy group of brave Norwegians, tough as nails, rowed it across the Atlantic. It was cold, it was wet, it was miserable, but they did it and brought it to the great exhibition in Chicago. I believe the remnants of that quote-unquote replica are still there. How many more versions, half-scale, full-scale, double-scale, 1.5 times scale replicas of Jokstad have been built is beyond my ken. I'm sure somebody can do a master's thesis just counting these so-called replicas. One was based at Mystic Seaport for a while, coming to think about it. So that was our image. The problem is that some parts of this image did not fully match what we were reading in the sagas, the great Norse epic poems at the time. In one of them, a type of vessel known as nar was described, or rather the bows of the ship were described, and I do apologize for what is about to be a series of sexist comments, but that vessel was described as having full rounded bows like the breasts of a young maiden. Well, look at this vessel. Does this look like full breast to you? If this is representative of above-mentioned Viking maidens of the Middle Ages, human anatomy must have looked quite differently back then from what it is more conventionally accepted to be nowadays. So something was not clearing. The Skudlev wrecks gave us the answer to this question. Suddenly, we had vessels that, even if they were not built exactly at the same date, they were sunk at approximately the same dates. Actually, they were sunk into groups. So not quite simultaneously, but close enough in age to be representative of the period. And they were quite different vessels. At the beginning, one of the ships actually was mistook for two separate wrecks. I will return to it because in some ways this is what enters the fantasy world of modern readership. For the other vessels, we finally had one of the big merchant vessels of the Vikings, the famous Nar. Vikings were not just raiders. Vikings were farmers, Vikings were traders, Vikings were explorers. And of course, everybody knows the story of Erik the Red and Leif Eriksson's discoveries in Greenland and North America. And initially, it was believed that this was done with this sort of vessels. Now, a much more probable version is that they were using for these long-distance voyages the much fuller-bodied Nar, which would have been a significantly better carrier and probably a more comfortable seaboat than the narrow, low, freeboard rowing vessels. The Nar is almost completely a sailing ship. It had oars on a platform in the stern that clearly were used to operate the vessel in constraining waters, for example, entering and leaving port. Most of the propulsion was carried out by a big square sail. Another type of the vessels that was discovered there was essentially a longship, not too dissimilar to the type that we have seen at Jokstad, for example, and in other partial remnants coming from the boglands. But this vessel was significantly preserved. It is known as Skudlev III. It was the first replica that was ever constructed of it, and proved to be a very fast and maneuverable vessel. The vessels known as Skudlev II and IV proved to be one single vessel. I'll return to it in a moment. Skudlev V and VI proved to be a smaller warship and a fishing boat. So the interesting thing is here that we have this big variety of types and sizes of vessels, but all of them have the distinctive characteristics of the shipbuilding tradition of the North, and specifically the so-called Viking Age. Of course, by the time they were buried in the mid-11th century, the Viking Age was already closing. What is the interesting thing about these vessels? They taught us a number of things. First of all, that yes, within the same tradition of clinker-built vessels, where the planking is assembled, it is riveted together with rows and iron rivets, supported by framing system, which was integral to the structure. And yes, you could assemble the planking without the frames. The frames could be added after that to add stiffness. When the museum was building the Skudlev II-IV vessel, the master shipwright showed us just how flexible this ship actually is. It's more than 38 meters, almost 40-meter long vessel. He grabbed the stern post of the vessel, shook it left and right with one of his hands, and you could see how the whole vessel rippled all the way to the bow. But that was before all the internal structure was completed. So, the other characteristic type of a Viking ship are the stem and the stern post around it. We keep on hearing this legend, this myth that in olden times master shipwrights were building purely by eye and by battens, because of course they are ignoramuses, they wouldn't know anything. This has been blown to pieces by the discoveries of Skudlev and a single stem found in the bogs of Scotland. Viking-style tradition. Why so? Because it is very clear that these stems were pre-cut, pre-shaped, with the clinker planking actually ending up in them. This is not visible on any of the kits that I have seen, but the hood ends of the planks are actually carved into the stem. So the planking has to match the landing pieces on the stems. And the stem that was found in Scotland is already carved. It was sunk intentionally in a bog for seasoning, but was never used, which proves beyond trace of a doubt that the master shipwright had predicted the shape of the vessel long before he started assembling even the backbone of the vessel. The same thing is visible on one of the Skudlev stems. There you see that the landing pads on the hood ends as carved on the stem do not match the number of planks. 2 of the planks of the vessel had to land on the same carving into the stem. And that is because the stem was calculated for broader planks than were available to the master shipwright. And that is another piece of evidence that these vessels, the master shipwrights who built these vessels, could predict the shape and were designing the ships, were not just assembling blindly and through ignorance. Thank you very much for watching. I'm sure that there will be more questions and more to discuss about these vessels. For example, we have not yet addressed the famous Drakkar, since I started pointing out that what normally we describe as Drakkars actually had nothing to do with the Drakkar. So perhaps in another episode we'll have to talk a little bit more about the Drakkar. Meanwhile, I'm told that I have overstayed my welcome. So with this, I would like to bid you a most wonderful rest of your day. Enjoy it. Forget about YouTube. Don't watch my movies. Go enjoy yourself and read books. Thank you so much for watching, liking and subscribing and all that. And I bid you goodbye.